Work on the aircraft that ultimately became the CF-100 began shortly after Victory Aircraft Limited of Hamilton, Ontario was purchased by the Hawker Siddeley Corporation in 1945. They renamed the company Avro Canada Limited as it reported to their aircraft manufacturing division. I'm going to call it Avro Canada from now on because it's easier to say. Victory had itself been nationalised from the National Steel Car Company in 1942 and had built 3,197 Avro Ansons and 430 Mark X Lancaster bombers for the RAF and Commonwealth forces. With the end of the war, however, its once 9,000-strong workforce dwindled to a mere 300. New products were needed to survive in the lean years of peace ahead. A jet fighter for the Royal Canadian Air Force was one of two projects that Avro prioritised, given the rapid ascendancy of the jet engine as the only power plant for a modern fighter. The project was based on a specification developed by the RCAF before the end of the Second World War. Even at this point, it was obvious to less reticent or perhaps more paranoid minds in Western militaries that once Germany was defeated, the Soviet Union would return to its prior status as a deadly adversary. Although at that time the Soviet strategic bombing fleet was non-existent, a situation could easily be envisaged in which fleets of aircraft came over the pole and across Canada's vast land area. It was also important to have an aircraft that was designed and built in Canada to give the country specification independence from US and British services. Avro were the main beneficiaries of this need, receiving initial funding in late 1945. Because of Canada's particular geography and climate, the RCAF wanted an aircraft with long range. Their ambition for combat radius was 650 nautical miles, including 15 minutes of combat at 40,000 feet. Since they were jet bombers, the fighter would require a maximum speed of at least 0.85 Mach and a rapid rate of climb upwards of 10,000 feet per minute. At this point, the prevailing wisdom was that very high altitude was the best place to fly a bomber to evade defenses. Supersonic speed wasn't a requirement for the fighter at this point, though. Finally, because the Canadian weather was frequently awful, and the Soviets could not be relied upon to keep to daylight hours, the fighter needed to be fully capable in all weathers. An early specification called for operations in air temperatures as low as -57 Celsius and as high as +45. That's about -70 to +113 in Fahrenheit, if that's your preferred scale. Two engines were also deemed essential in order to give a safety margin when operating over large stretches of inhospitable wilderness. As well as the aerodynamic and power plant requirements, the role it was meant to fulfill meant the fitment of a powerful radar. And since computerized automation was in its infancy, that meant a second crewman to run the intercept while the pilot flew the plane. Although all of this seems modest in the 2020s, in 1945 it was a tall order. The RCAF essentially wanted a domestically designed and built fighter with equivalent performance to the English Electric Canberra, development of which had started in 1944, but which wouldn't see service until 1951. Undaunted and significantly motivated by the money being shoveled in their direction, Avro presented drawings of 3 potential aircraft to the RCAF. These sketches are all I've found of the proposals. All are straight-winged, which is little surprise as the fruits of analysis of the Me-262 and other windfall from the Third Reich's aircraft industry had not yet been widely socialized. The first design is therefore quite Supermarine Attacker-like, with a svelte fuselage, the engines presumably buried in the center fuselage and exiting from a single jet pipe. The second is directionally similar to the eventual CF-100 with pronounced intakes at the wing roots, although its engines are not podded at this stage. It was, however, the third design with wing-mounted nacelles which was selected for further development in October. Detailed design for a fighter based on this concept commenced in May 1947, led by former de Havilland designer John Frost. This led to the construction of a wooden mock-up, which you can see here. In this process, a serious debate was had about swept wings, but it was ultimately felt that the aerodynamics were so unknown and the immediacy of the RCF's requirement was so urgent that it was best to stick with straight wings. The intention was that a follow on aircraft known as CF-103 would introduce swept wings and transonic performance at a later date. Sometime in the detailed design process, the wing nacelles moved near to the fuselage. Within those nacelles would be another Avro product, the Arenda axial flow turbojet. This was the result of another swift bit of mergers and acquisitions activity by the company. Jet engine design had begun in Canada in early 1943 as a result of a mission sent to investigate Frank Whittle's work in Great Britain. Test engines began to run on the bench in 1944 at Turbo Research Limited, another state-owned business. At the end of the war, Roy Dobson from Hawker Siddeley swooped in and bought it as the government sought to dispose of its wartime industries. Arenda was part of a roadmap that began with the Canuck research engine of 1948. It would, of course, famously be the power plant for later marks of the Canadair Sabre, as well as the Canuck. Armament for the aircraft was 4 hard-hitting 30mm Aden revolver cannons. This was the default armament for all British second-generation fighter projects and would shred a B-29 class bomber in short order. A radar with effective detection range of 5 to 10 miles was also needed. Initially, this was to be the British Mark 17 air intercept radar that would eventually equip the stately Meteor NF-11 night fighter. It was based on the innovative Mark 9 of 1943, development of which had been terminally set back when its lead engineer was killed in a friendly fire incident. He had set off in one of 2 bow fighters to test the new set's ability to discern a cloud of chaff from a real aircraft. On their way back, they were intercepted by Spitfires and his aircraft was shot down, taking the prototype radar with it. The pace of Mark 9 development never really recovered from this, and the subsequent Mark 17 lagged behind contemporary US sets, essentially bringing 1940s technology into service in the early 1950s. As the design came together, construction of tooling for and thus manufacture of 3 XC-100 prototypes began in January 1948. Because of the need for speed in the program, the 30mm cannons were set aside for the time being to allow further development to take place. A battery of 8 50 caliber machine guns replaced them. It was also determined that the still unavailable British Mark 17 would be replaced with an off-the-shelf American radar when the time came to fit one. It wasn't just British companies that were lagging, though. Since their Chinook only ran for the first time in March of 48, there was no chance of a Render being ready for flight before the end of the decade, let alone the end of the year. 2 £6,500 Force Rolls-Royce Avon RA2s were thus selected to power the first prototypes. In late 1949, the first CF-100 was completed. Although it had ballast in place of the radar and weapons, and Avons instead of Arendas, it represented a giant leap forward for the Canadian aviation industry. They were no longer just licensed manufacturers of aircraft, they were designers as well. On January the 19th, 1950, the CF-100 Mark I took to the skies for the first time in front of a crowd of thousands. It was painted gloss black with white lightning bolts running down the fuselage and engines. At the controls was Bill Waterton, seconded to Avro Canada from Gloucester. It was a cold day and the Canuck was carrying only a light fuel load. As a result, it bounded into the air in less than 1,500 feet, pursued by a Vampire chase plane. The first slow-speed, low-altitude tests were satisfactorily concluded. It was a great debut. Waterton's only major criticism was the solid dive brakes. Slotted ones would soon replace them. Buoyed by a wave of enthusiasm, the CF-100 was in high demand during 1950. It flew demonstrations in both Canada and the US, traveling to DC and to Boston. The latter nearly ended in disaster when one of the Avons suddenly spooled down as the aircraft was accelerating down the runway. Just as the announcer was lauding the CF-100 for its exceptional climb rate, Waterton was staggering into the air. Bill Waterton returned to Gloucester in early 1951. He was replaced as lead test pilot by Bruce Warren, an experienced RCAF flight lieutenant. Only a few months later, on April the 5th, Warren was flying the second prototype with Robert Ostrander when the aircraft abruptly entered a dive and crashed, killing both men. The cause was judged to be a failure of the oxygen system, not helped by the fact that Avro had too few oxygen masks available. Sharing the masks between multiple pilots wore them excessively and introduced play in the hose attachments. In any case, the exact cause was never fully established. Test flights and demonstrations continued, although a plan to appear at Farnborough in 1951 had to be abandoned. Hawker Siddeley's management were more than a little bit disappointed. The CF-100 was their hottest prospect, although Gloucester's Javelin was not far from taking its first flight. US pilots did, however, fly the CF-100 at Wright-Patterson to evaluate it and were apparently impressed. Although they were flying Avon-engined aircraft, the Mark I was substantially lighter than the versions that would follow. At takeoff, carrying 680 gallons of fuel, it weighed only 26,600 pounds. The RCAF, who accepted the first Mark II for testing on October 17, 1951, were also very happy with what they were getting. Mark II introduced the Arenda engines that came off the test bench in 1952. The first Mark II, powered by them, took flight on June the 20th and was extensively evaluated by Avro before its handover. Interestingly, despite the excellent reputation the Arenda has, the test pilot report said that performance was little different to the Avon. Only at high altitudes did they see some marginal improvement in performance. 5 Mark II aircraft would join the test program, serving as the pre-production prototypes for the type. Everything seemed well set up for success. Indeed, by 1951, Avro were deep into the development of the Mark III and the Mark IV, intended for operations with the RCAF. In March of that year, a memo circulated within the company based on high-level discussions in Ottawa. They expected an order for 718 complete aircraft and 738 spare engines for a total order value of over $500 million. They were initially disappointed when in June 1951 they received an order for only 70 Mark IIIs rather than the 124 they had been expecting. This, however, turned out to be because the RCAF were excited by the Mark IV's proposed rocket and gun armament and were intending to up their order for that version. But trouble was brewing. As early as the third flight, Bill Waterton started having difficulty controlling the aircraft. When he landed, the outer skin on the center fuselage adjacent to the wings was seriously buckled. It seemed that the damage had been caused by the wing spar flexing more than expected, where it joined the center section. When Waterton was demonstrating the aircraft to dignitaries in Washington, D.C. a few flights later, the same thing happened again, then again at the Canadian Exhibition Air Show in August. Something was clearly very wrong. Closer investigation rapidly revealed the culprit, and it endangered the entire CF-100 program. When the engines had first moved from the mid-wing to a position flush with the fuselage, the intention had been to rest them on top of the main wing carry-through structure. This position was regarded as advantageous because it allowed the engines to be easily removed for servicing. But as study of the mock-up progressed, it became clear that in this position the engines were too far forward and too high up. Vision for the crew was restricted, and more seriously, the center of gravity was too far forward and the aerodynamics were compromised. A decision was therefore taken to move the engines back and down. This in turn meant that the carry-through structure needed to be modified with a hollow for the engines to rest in. Doubler plates were added in an attempt to retain the strength of that section. What the test flights revealed was that the plates didn't give enough strength. Since the structure now flexed more than intended, the structural aluminium ring that supported the engines also flexed excessively. As a result, the aircraft's skin warped, and given enough G-force, the structural ring would snap with an audible bang, endangering the aircraft. Avro initially downplayed this problem. They fitted additional strengthening plates, and they hoped for the best. But at this point in the program, aircraft were being handed over to RCAF pilots, and they weren't smooth and gentle like the Avro test pilots. They flew the CF-100 like a fighter plane, and they heard the bang of a structural break on almost every flight they took. Finally, in the fall of 1951, when two failures happened at the same airshow in Toronto, Avro management appreciated the severity of the issue. They now had a whole line rolling making the Mark IIIs, and they'd invested in the machine tools they'd need for series production. The wing carry-through is one of the most important components of the airframe. It transmits and absorbs many of the forces that act on the fighter as it maneuvers horizontally and vertically. Most other structural members are therefore built around it, and a redesign would result in a major rethink of the whole concept. Vaclav Savinsky, the head of structural stress at Avro Canada, was assigned to find a fix. He eventually developed a pin joint, fitted at the location where the wing joined the nacelle. This, in combination with yet more doubler plates, gave the required strength. His work was completed in February 1952 and began to be retrofitted to existing aircraft. Chavinsky's solution, however, came much too late to mollify the Canadian government. The conclusions from an investigation into Bruce Warren's fatal crash had not painted Avro in a good light. Losing 2 men and a valuable prototype because they couldn't be bothered to source more oxygen masks verged on criminal negligence. Their failure to seriously tackle the structural issues also felt like a company who were unserious about the national defense emergency to which they were being paid to respond. So, despite the delivery of the first aircraft to the RCAF in October 1951, in November, Avro received a letter from the Canadian government telling them to suspend the program indefinitely. As well as the crash and the structural problems, deliveries to the RCAF were exceptionally slow, and the aircraft they were getting weren't anything like combat capable. In April 1952, a Canadian MP summed up the situation in a parliamentary speech by remarking that 2 years after the CF-100's dramatic debut, the country was effectively no closer to having a viable all-weather defense against Soviet bombers. The pitiful few aircraft that the RCAF did have were unarmed, and in any case, they had all been taken back to the factory for essential modifications. It's hard not to sympathise with the position of lay politicians on the matter. They were used to a war economy speed at which aircraft moved from concept to production at a crazy rate. And Canadair progressed their license-built Sabre program with similar alacrity. But these were much simpler products. This CF-100 was a much larger aircraft, full of advanced systems, some of which were first of a kind and all of which had their own torturous development roadmap. Onto this must be added the Arenda, which progressed rapidly for a relatively advanced jet engine project, but was still a relatively advanced jet engine project in a country that had not yet flown any significant military aircraft engine. Nowadays, we'd call this a concurrency issue, and it also affected contemporary all-weather fighter projects in other countries. CF-100 was no worse, but neither was it any better. But $50 million had been spent. The Soviet threat seemed to get more ominous by the day, and people thus felt both let down and unprotected. A lot of people were now on Avro's case. In fairness to them, they were now making progress. Part of the reason that the first Mark II was back at Moulton was that it was being used for armament testing. Other airframes were being used to develop dual-control trainers, and one of the early Mark IIIs, serial 18112, was being converted as the prototype for the rocket arm Mark IV. Although the first full production Mark III was completed in June 1952, for the most part the RCAF was supplied with a variety of different Mark IIs and IIIs carrying all sorts of modifications and equipment. It wasn't a sensible way to run a program of this scale. To give you an example, by the summer of 1952, the Operational Training Unit had received 3 pre-production aircraft, serials 18108, 109, and 110. These were the first 3 pre-production Mark IIIs. However, each was considerably different from the others. Although they all had the same engines and they looked the same, 109 was 20 knots faster than the other 2. And of course, they all had different niggles. Nose gear would fail to retract properly. Hydraulic pumps failed because the Doughty pump that had been specified had insufficient capacity. Fuel transfer valves stuck and radios didn't work reliably. When the engineering officer inspected the upper wing surface of one of the new arrivals, he discovered that some of the screws were held in place by chewing gum. On another aircraft, a row of rivets on the fuselage ran off the skin edge. He also found that although the aircraft was supposed to be identical, their wiring diagrams strongly suggested that they were not. The whole thing was inexcusably slapdash for such a program. Leaks occurred and concerned politicians continued to apply pressure. By March 1953, only 16 aircraft had been delivered at an overall cost of $100 million. Unsurprisingly, questions continued to be asked about whether the aircraft was a dud and Canada should cut its losses. On the plus side, the experienced Canadian pilots felt that it was an easier aircraft to fly than a Meteor, and it retained its amazing climb rate and overall responsiveness. So despite all of the setbacks and the noise, the program continued. Some of this was undoubtedly due to the lack of a better option. The F-89 Scorpion was available on the other side of the border, but it cost $1.1 million an aircraft versus $700,000 for the CF-100, and of course it came without any of the industrial benefits. All of the other options were either compromised interim types like the Starfire or the Meteor Night Fighter, or they were jammed tomorrow like the F-102 and Javelin. And in any case, the Mark III was now ready for limited operational deployment. Much of today's writing about the CF-100 focuses on the Mark V, but the line started with 70 Mark IIIs and they saw some squadron service. As delivered, the Mark III was a large aircraft for the time. Its wingspan was 52 feet. Later, when it was found that tipped tanks improved handling as well as range, the span with those tanks went up to 57 feet and 6 inches. The fuselage was 52 feet and 3 inches long and 10 feet 3 inches high at the top of the canopy, 14 feet 6 inches at the top of the vertical fin. Empty weight was 23,000 pounds and the normal takeoff weight was 33,400. Construction was all metal, with the majority being aluminium. 1,552 US gallons of fuel was carried, split roughly half and half between tanks in either wing and the two fuselage tanks. With tip tanks, fuel capacity rose to 2,248 gallons. In the first 20 aircraft, the tanks fed a pair of 6,000-pound Force Arrender 2 engines. These early engines were essentially pre-production models and they suffered cracks in their compression stages amongst other reliability issues. The remaining 49 Mark IIIs were fitted with the first real production Arrender, the Mark VIII, which also delivered 6,000 pounds of force but was far more reliable. Thrust-to-weight ratio was thus in the region of 0.36 at takeoff, which is actually rather low for the era. The Arrender engine carries with it considerable mystique in the aviation community. If you're unaware, then you can easily form the opinion that it was an extraordinarily light, fuel-efficient, powerful and reliable engine. It was definitely excellent, but its service in the Canuck definitely also showed that it had reliability issues. For example, in really heavy rain, early marks of Arrender would fail because rapid cooling would shrink the engine casing. The turbine blades would cut into the casing and the engine would disintegrate. In fairness, though, because of the arduous service life of the aircraft, which operated in extreme temperatures and climatic conditions, these kinds of issues probably emerged at a higher rate than engines in services in more moderate climates. But still, it wasn't perfect. Although designed for a maximum speed of 0.85 Mach, the CF-100 was capable of slightly more than that in level flight. That does sound like a good thing, but in fact it led to some concerns about whether the structure of the aircraft could cope with the additional performance. Pilots soon demonstrated that the aircraft could comfortably exceed Mach 1 in a dive. On at least one occasion, a high G pullout from such a dive led to an airframe being written off. In general, though, the CF-100 proved to be sufficiently rugged to deal with what sensible pilots would throw at it, and no modifications were made to limit performance. The crew sat in tandem on Martin Baker ejection seats under a two-piece bubble canopy. Tuning the canopy release so that the ejection could safely be accomplished took 2 years, being finally sorted out only after squadrons were using the type in the middle 1950s. Flight controls were hydraulically boosted with artificial feel. The pilot sat in front with the radar observer behind. Cockpit ergonomics were not the best. For example, because the control column obscured the compass, it had to be canted over to the right for the pilot to see it. The complexity of the fuel transfer system between the 4 tanks led to the control system looking like something out of a nuclear power station. Operating the CF-100 required a great deal of engineering understanding and training. Chief amongst these complex systems was the AN/APG-33 radar, a unit shared by the F-89A Scorpion. It could detect a bomber-sized target at up to 10 miles and calculate a pursuit curve attack using the attached E-1 fire control computer. Although quite advanced for a fighter radar of the time, the Mark III CF-100 had quite limited options to actually engage a target based on the steering instructions that it provided. Because other weapons were unavailable at this stage of development, the Mark III had 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns with 200 rounds per gun, contained in a large ventral magnesium casing. The gun pack weighed 1,108 pounds, ammunition an additional 480 pounds. In 1942, this would have been a decent main armament. By the time that 1952 and 53 rolled around, it was frankly an inadequate battery, particularly for attacking a bomber. The issue wasn't the aircraft. 83,000 rounds of 50 cal were fired in testing, and the CF-100 proved to be a stable and accurate platform. There were, however, problems with the gun pack. It was a clever idea in that it could be rapidly lowered off the aircraft and reloaded, faster than magazines fitted in the forward fuselage. But it had problems. Because the aircraft were deployed in extremely cold conditions, the weapons were being cold-soaked down to minus 37 Celsius. Early squadron use therefore showed a high degree of stoppages due to faulty ammunition and parts falling off the guns. Spent cartridges were also ejected into the airstream, striking the fuselage and causing dents. More seriously, the 8 guns produced a lot of gas in a confined space. Venting that space proved much harder than Avro expected, leading to severe restrictions being placed on squadrons in terms of burst length. A maximum of 3 seconds of firing was allowed, with 10-second intervals between bursts. This compounded the well-known issue of the machine gun's throw weight. In a 2-second firing pass, the 8 guns put down roughly 14.5 kilos of shells. Effective range was about 1,000 yards. That just wasn't enough firepower to guarantee a killing hit on a B-29-sized target. The Tu-4 also had 23mm cannons as defensive armament, which were effective out to 3,000 feet. The Bison was as fast as the Canuck, so less accurate deflection shooting would be required, restricting the number of hits that could be scored. Moreover, the gun pack wasn't as easy to handle as the RCAF had expected. Although it could be switched out for a fully loaded replacement in under 7 minutes in warm summer weather, in the winter, gloved hands took more than 30. Clearing stoppages on guns in the pack was also difficult because of lack of access to the tightly packed weapons. It was this overall armament deficiency that limited the usefulness and service life of the Mark III. But it was still important as a platform for training and tactics development. By early 1956, dozens of them were deployed to operational squadrons. The syllabus for Canadian jet night fighter crews was developed through observation in this period. In May 1950, a delegation went to the UK to work with the crews flying the first Meteor NF-11s. Later that year, another group went across the southern border to Washington State to observe the tactics employed by F-94B Starfire GCI controllers and aircrews. In fact, by the fall of 1950, there were 8 RCAF crews in the US, training on a variety of aircraft, including B-25s fitted with the AN/APG-33 radar. Over time, Avro and the OTU worked together on ground control training and practices. By the end of 1954, they could scramble an alert pair of CF-100s from the hangar within 3.5 minutes. By November 1954, they were supporting 9 16-plane squadrons operating the CF-100 in the field, plus additional squadrons at the OTU. The majority of these were a new version, the Mark IV. The original 1953 contract for CF-100s included the 70 Mark IIIs and 300 Mark IVs. For speed, the first 50 of those were to be armed solely with machine guns. The remaining 250 would also have rockets. Experimentation with alternative armament for the CF-100 began in 1952 when a Mark III was fitted with 4 Pontiac T160 revolver cannons. Although it would eventually see extended service as the M39, in its early days the T160 was not a reliable weapon, and so it proved on the CF-100. After numerous gun failures and inevitable gun gas buildup problems, the RCAF and Avro decided that it wasn't worth pursuing that idea. Alongside experimentation with cannons, from 1951 various RCAF teams had been in the US, spending time with prototypes and early production versions of the F-94C Starfire, the F-89 Scorpion, and the F-86D Saberdog. These were all armed with 2 3/4-inch folding fin aircraft rockets and Hughes fire control systems offering automation of the pursuit curve and firing process. By the middle of 1952, Avro were testing both a retractable belly pack similar to that on the F-86D and wingtip pods like those on the Scorpion and Starfire. Having considered multiple options, the RCAF decided on quite small pods that contained only 29 rockets, as they believed that salvos of greater than 60 rockets offered no benefit. The belly pack option contained only 48 rockets. The CF-100 would thus carry less than half as many rockets as a Scorpion. Ground-firing trials suggested that the rocket launchers were reliable so long as the electrical firing contacts were properly cleaned between sorties. Airborne firing trials began in January 1954. An early discovery was that lowering the belly pack, a process that took about a third of a second, would cause the nose to pitch up and thus spoil the pilot's aim, requiring adjustments to the autopilot to automatically compensate during the firing process. The buffeting was so bad with the pod lowered that it actually caused the loss of the test aircraft on August 23, 1954. It seems that fuel lines were ruptured by the turbulence, which then ignited, causing 2 explosions and a fire that led to the pilots ejecting. Insoluble stability problems aside, it was also hard to reload the pack on the ground. The rockets also emerged into disturbed air around the nose, impacting accuracy, and there was a risk of the engines ingesting gas and debris from the rocket exhaust. The ventral pod was thus abandoned in September. Wingtip pods were therefore the primary armament for the new Mark IV CF-100, although the aircraft retained the 8 machine guns as secondary armament. The pods cost $10,000 each and they were automatically ejected upon firing. To save money, most squadrons wired the pods not to eject. They also sometimes operated without the frangible nose cones as they were considered less frangible than planned. A final point on the rocket pods is that they could only be armed on the ground using an arming device on the wingtip. If a CF-100 took off on a peacetime mission with the safeties on and things changed in flight, then the rockets would be unavailable as the safeties couldn't be deactivated by the pilot. Both to save money and reduce risk, the weapons practice unit at Cold Lake produced 6-round pods for use in training, enabling an aircraft to make 2 passes at much reduced cost. For completeness, I'll also mention that there were 14 sorties carried out to explore whether the CF-100 could be a strike aircraft. 21 1,000-pound and 20 100-pound practice bombs were dropped in 1954. Although accuracy as a bomb-carrying platform was fine, the weakness of the CF-100's structure made it unsafe as a real close-air support platform, where 9G and potentially higher pull-ups might be needed to evade ground fire in an actual conflict. Fire control in the Mark IV was upgraded to the Hughes MG2, including a larger AN/APG-40 radar and an expanded nose cone. During an attack run, the computer used range, position, and bearing information to calculate a firing solution. The system was neatly integrated, to the extent that in the event of battle damage, the whole nose cone could be unbolted as a single unit and a new one attached without recalibration. Electrical power for the radar and the avionics was drawn from the starboard engine. 1,600 Arenda engines and spares were also ordered at the same time, including the 6,500-pound Force Arenda 9 and the 7,000-pound Force Arenda 11 engines that would be used with the Mark IV. Each engine and relevant spares cost $75,000 at 1953 prices, about $900,000 today. 137 Mark IVs had the 9, and they were known as Mark IV-As. The balance of 141 flew with the 11, and they were Mark IV-Bs. During Mark IV production, the RCAF christened the CF-100 the Canuck. Apparently, the runner-up in the competition was the Jaeger, a type of hunting seabird. Amongst RCAF pilots, though, the Canuck was typically known as the CLUNK because of the noise produced by the forward landing gear during retraction into its well after takeoff. As deliveries to squadrons accelerated, 49 Mark IIIs were converted into dual-control trainers to convert more pilots to the type. These were not combat capable, as they had all the guns, the sights, and the radar removed in exchange for 2 cockpits with full flight controls. Development of the ultimate Canuck, the Mark V, began in late 1954 when it was realised that the CF-100's real performance at high altitude was not as good as expected. Given the emergence of the M4 Bison, which was assumed to be able to climb well above 40,000 feet, something needed to be done to increase the Canuck's service ceiling. This resulted in the Mark IV HAV, or high altitude version, which featured a range of weight-saving modifications, including removal of the gun pack. Wingtip extensions were also fitted. The modified prototype was 4,000 pounds lighter than a standard Mark IV-B, tipping the scales at 33,700 pounds for normal takeoff. Its performance was excellent. Testers recorded that it performed at 45,000 feet like the normal Mark IV did at 39,000. Altitudes above 49,000 feet were readily attainable. It flew past 50,000 for the first time on the 21st of December 1955. Early testing had been sufficiently good that the first true Mark V flew in October 1955. It had 44-inch wingtip extensions, and it had been on a series of crash diets. Mod 1000 saved £500 by removing the engine anti-icing systems, the map table in the navigator's cockpit, and the fire extinguisher in the pilot's cockpit. Another package removed the guns and the gun sight, while adding 24-inch extensions to each tailplane tip to deal with the resultant change in centre of gravity. Yet another mod, numbered 1071, removed the JATO rocket fittings and other items. RCAF assessed various configurations between September 1956 and April 1957. They also trialled vortex generators on the upper wing surface near the leading edge. These increased the takeoff run, but they moved the aerodynamic ceiling up from 49,200 feet to 53,000. Unfortunately, having enough manoeuvring energy at these altitudes would require more powerful engines, which were not on the cards, so the idea was dropped. 180 orders were placed for Mark Vs, and the first was handed over to the RCAF in December 1956. Unit price was $525,000. Avro also converted 48 Mark IV-Bs to Mark V standard for $51,759 per aircraft. All of these initial aircraft used the Arenda 11, which gave £7,400 of thrust. Later examples off the line had the marginally improved Arenda 14, which gave £7,500. Although there were several other significant experiments, the Mark V was the ultimate operational Canuck. It also served with the Belgian Air Force, who selected it in July 1957 over the Gloucester Javelin, the Sud Aviation Voiture 2N, the North American F-86K Sabre, the Saab Lanson, and the Northrop F-89D Scorpion. The order came about because of fears in the alliance about a lack of all-weather fighters, given the endless delays in getting advanced types into service. The complexity and cost of those aircraft, both to supply and operate, also put them out of reach of the average European country. Straight wings and comparatively simple avionics, therefore, became more attractive. In total, 54 Canucks were bought for Belgium for $42 million, of which 75% was paid for by the US and 25% was paid for by the Canadian government. Only 53 aircraft were ever delivered, as one of them was damaged prior to delivery. They replaced 24 very tired Meteor NF-11s. Having hopefully given a sense of how the aircraft came to be, its on-paper capabilities, and the various versions, I'm going to talk a little bit about its operational employment and then finish with subjects like Velvet Glove and Sparrow 2. The CF-100 was designed to do one job: intercept Soviet bombers coming from the north. During peacetime, it performed similar duties for contacts detected by the radar lines that spanned Alaska and northern Canada. These were usually single aircraft, such as wayward airliners or light aircraft. But the RCAF needed to be ever vigilant. Any contact could turn out to be a first strike in a massed attack. So as soon as a radar station detected an unidentified contact, a telephone call would be made to the appropriate interceptor base. A klaxon would sound in an alert shack and 4 men would race to their aircraft. Once the engines were turning, the pilots would steer their aircraft the short distance out onto the runway. Training and familiarity were essential when climbing into the Canuck. Cockpit ergonomics were best described as haphazard, with controls and dials seemingly thrown willy-nilly into the space with little thought to how they'd be used. Fortunately, the crews were exceptionally well trained. With the throttles to the stops, they'd surge into the air. The CF-100 was equipped to use either 2 or 6 JATO rockets if a really fast takeoff was required. This, however, required the pilot to be very alert, as the acceleration was such that the pilot would be unable to push the control column forward while the rockets were firing. Once they were airborne, they would retract the gear, eject the rockets, and compensate for the abrupt nose-down change in trim and climb as fast as possible while turning onto the correct bearing. The navigator would already be heads down by this point, consumed in his world of green fluorescent tubes. The Hughes MG2 that he was operating had 3 main modes, providing automatic search, manual search, and auto-target tracking. It could also detect navigation beacons and provide ground mapping to identify landmarks, detect ships, and so on. Typically, CF-100s performed intercepts under close radar control by GCI all the way to the target. The alternative was broadcast control, in which navigation was by GeoRef, a basic method using latitude and longitude, with the navigator plotting the data against his own position in an effort to locate the target. Achieving an intercept at night under broadcast control required great skill on the part of the navigator, and it was considered a real achievement. The RCAF's particular flavour of interceptor tactics was known as Harlequin. In this, the 2 aircraft would take off at 20-second intervals. The trailing plane would lock onto the leader while still on the runway and then fly to the target 4 miles in trail. Once the leader made his attack with rockets, the wingman could immediately follow in and ensure that the target was destroyed. As with other advanced rocket-armed interceptors, the CF-100 crews were trained to attack from a cone that spanned dead ahead to 45 degrees off the target's nose. This was done to avoid the bomber's defensive fire, which was weakest dead ahead, and to reduce time to intercept. Although advanced for the era, the CLUNK's avionics were pretty rudimentary. Once he acquired it by steering the radar antenna using a small joystick on the right of the cockpit, the navigator would see the bomber as a steadily brightening dot on his screen. The crosshairs would now start to align with the target. At the last moment, the system would fire the rockets. A momentary bloom would appear on the radar screen, and then nothing. Typical exercises assume that the Soviets would send a bomber stream. Coordinating attacks on these streams placed great demands on the ground controllers. Harlequin allowed them to essentially double their firepower and increase the success rate of an intercept, but it did little to increase the total number of targets that could be attacked. Over time, GCI training allowed the operators to keep track of more than 1 interceptor flight at a time. Each control center was ultimately able to execute attacks on a stream with a dozen CF-100s, each rolling in sequence. This, of course, assumed that the Soviets would indeed send a package of bombers in a defensive formation at altitude, which might have been true in the Tu-4 era, but it became increasingly unlikely as the performance of bombers like the M4 increased, but available numbers markedly decreased. From 1957, Canada and the US established NORAD as a joint command that would, in relatively short order, amass a giant network of ground-based and floating radar stations, supported by radar-equipped blimps and super constellations. They were facing a relatively small number of jet bombers on one-way missions to nuke US and Canadian infrastructure and cities. Numerous large-scale exercises were held from the middle 1950s onwards. Dozens of SAC aircraft simulated Soviet attackers coming over from Alaska, the Central Arctic, and Greenland. Even as late as 1961, the CF-100 crews gave a good account of themselves in their obsolete aircraft. In fact, in the final Sky Shield exercise the CLUNK participated in during October 1961, the CF-100s had the highest kill ratio of any NORAD interceptor. I suspect, having said that the devil was in the details, as we don't know what types of aircraft that the CLUNKs were being sent after, what role they were playing, and how effective or otherwise the supersonic types were feeling that day, but even so, it's impressive for a geriatric. Canberras, for example, were able to cruise above the CLUNK's service ceiling, and they were therefore impossible to intercept. Although big exercises were the best publicised form of training, North American airspace was a target-rich environment every day in the 1950s. A steady stream of B-36s and B-47s crisscrossed the continent. F-89s, CF-100s, Sabre Dogs, and later on Delta Daggers rose to intercept. The fun ended abruptly when a collision between an F-102 and a B-47 during a practice lead collision intercept caused SAC to terminate improper air intercept training exercises between ADC and SAC. SAC saw no value in this kind of practice. At their peak in the late 1950s, 9 squadrons flew CF-100s within NORAD. They operated alongside the F-89s and F-102s, plus some US Navy squadrons of Skyrays. All of this air power was, as I said, backed up by Nike SAMs, a continent-spanning radar network, the Constellation radar pickets, and floating Texas towers. It was a remarkable collection of hardware and manpower, particularly given that a decade previously North America was essentially undefended against Soviet bombers. The Canadian assessment of the CF-100 was that it was the best of the NORAD interceptors on an all-round basis. As I've alluded to just now, I consider this to be a bit fanciful. It's fair to say that the CLUNK was superior to the lumbering F-89D as a Tu-4 interceptor. The CF-100 was 50 miles an hour faster, it climbed better, and it had about 10 to 20% better range since the Scorpion pilot would have to use his afterburners to extract any kind of climb from the aircraft. My view is that things get murkier though when the F-89H and J are discussed. Although it was still slow, the H had a superior fire control system and it had the Hughes Falcon, expanding its lethal envelope out from point-blank range with rockets to about 3 miles. The J obviously has the Genie, which, although effective, was very much a last-chance saloon kind of weapon. The F-102 is superior to the CF-100 in essentially all aspects except range. It also has the Falcon, although one can make a case that a second crewman is more useful than early 1950s automation when it comes to all-weather interception. Performance-wise, the disappointing Deuce is on another level, though. F-101 is somewhere between Deuce and CLUNK avionics-wise, but has better performance than either, good range, and a second man in the back. F-106 was obviously on a totally different level. Anyhow, you get the idea. The CF-100 was a really good early 1950s straight-winged interceptor. One could argue that it was the best of breed, but its breed was obsolete essentially on delivery because of the rapid development of jet bombers by the Soviet Union. That it was highly rated at the end of the 1950s says more about the experience and training of its crews, both in the air and on the ground, than about the platform itself. The Canucks' lack of 1950s level aircraft performance led to at least 2 serious attempts to find an air-to-air missile that could expand its potential engagement range and thus the aircraft's useful life. Air-to-air missiles had, of course, been experimented with in several nations during World War II. No truly workable weapons were deployed, but research continued in the second half of the 1940s. Because the country was high on aviation in this period, the Canadian government had instigated its own missile program in June 1950 as part of a tripartite agreement with the US and the UK. The program was run in Valcartier, Quebec by the Canadian Armament Research and Development Establishment, CARD to their friends. Their objective was to provide an independent supply of guided missiles for Canada, or at the very least provide sufficient knowledge of these systems that the Air Force could be effectively trained in their use. In their first year, they developed designs for a pursuit course semi-active homing weapon that they named the Velvet Glove. Quite why they named it this is lost to history. It was, from a historical perspective, quite an unremarkable weapon that used a US-supplied Aerojet solid-fuel rocket motor, but was otherwise entirely of Canadian design. It was a 10-foot, 8-inch long missile on the same 8-inch diameter as the Sparrow. At launch, it weighed 318 pounds, and it was accelerated to Mach 2.3 in 1.9 seconds when launched at the 0.85 Mach that a Canuck could achieve. Range was 2.5 miles. Guidance was semi-active, with the square front fins acting as the rudders. Test firings from ground launchers commenced in November 1951, and over the next 2 years, 28 missiles were fired. It was hardly a breakneck pace. The first air launch was made by a modified F-86E Sabre on the 27th of August 1953. Testing then stepped up, and by 1955, as many as 500 Velvet Gloves had been manufactured, and mostly had been fired to refine the system. In parallel, Avro began work to mate the Velvet Glove to the Canuck, and to modify its fire control system to suit. The aircraft could carry up to 4 missiles on underwing pylons, but as testing proceeded, the reality of Velvet Glove's performance became clear. The missile motor just wasn't powerful enough for the kind of snap-up attack that a CF-100 would need if it was to attack a Bison travelling at 50,000 feet. Furthermore, the aerodynamics of the missile, in particular its small fins, meant that it manoeuvred quite poorly above 30,000 feet. An Avro report in 1956 suggested that the probability of kill when 4 missiles were launched at a bomber flying at 30,000 feet was 0.75. If the bomber was at 40,000 feet, then the probability of kill fell to just 0.34. At 50,000, it was close to zero. Worse still, 4 missiles increased drag on the aircraft by 40%, severely decreasing the Interceptor's overall performance. Attempts to increase warhead size as an interim measure were dismissed as pointless. The program was abandoned in 1957, having cost the Canadian taxpayer a relatively modest $24 million, $270 million today. While Velvet Glove was in its final years, the RCAF began exploring another missile, which they also hoped would arm their intended successor for the CLUNK, the CF-105. This was the Sparrow II, a US Navy weapon that married the active radar seeker head of the cancelled Oriole missile to the 8-inch body of the Sparrow I beam rider. From 1955 onwards, the RCAF had Avro begin the process of modifying a Mark V CF-100 into an advanced version able to successfully attack B-47 and B-52 class bombers operating above the altitude of the Interceptor. Given the speed of the attackers, Avro analysis showed that even if all the equipment was functioning properly, there was only a small window in which such an attack could be successful. It was, however, better than nothing. To give the Interceptor some chance of success, the proposed Mark VI was fitted with Arrender 11R engines that gave 8,250 pounds of force. Avro also lightened and strengthened the structure and redesigned the tailplane and elevators. But given the relatively pessimistic view on the likely usefulness of this super CLUNK, interest in the Mark VI waned and it was cancelled in October 1957. Avro also offered a Mark V-M that had some of the features of the Mark VI, including the afterburning engines, but lacked these structural modifications. In 1957, early trials aircraft were sent to Point Mugu to work on the Sparrow program. This was a complex program, and it went both slowly and badly, despite the large number of missile launches. For the most part, the launches themselves went badly. As I've talked about before in my excessively long video on the Sparrow II was just too far ahead of its time. The Seeker was a small and powerful K-band set that theoretically allowed the missile to detect and engage a target at 5 miles. But in this era, K-band radars were easily confused by water vapor, making operations near clouds or in rain challenging. Furthermore, the radar operated straight off the rail, something that even modern missiles like the AMRAAM don't do, as it risks the computer taking matters into its own hands and going somewhere random. Reports from testing bear this out. A Canadian pilot made a launch from a US Navy F-3D Skyknight. The missile left the aircraft, then immediately turned sharply across the launcher's nose, breaking up as it did so. Very few targets were hit, and only 2 launches were made from CF-100s at Point Mugu, both in September 1958. At around the same time, the decision to cancel CF-105 was taken, and although Sparrow 2 development moved to the Cold Lake Proving Ground in Canada, where many more firings took place, the Sparrow 2 never saw service. The US Navy had also given up on the type in favour of the Sparrow 3, officially due to motor issues. Remarkably, this wasn't even the end of proposals to give the Canuck a missile. Towards the end, when Avro were trying everything they could think of to keep open in the wake of the Arrow cancellation and the end of CLUNK operations, they proposed a version with either 4 Falcon 2 Genies or 4 Sidewinders. Each of these gave a differential altitude of about 2,000 feet, which probably wasn't much use in practice. Amusingly, given the performance of the Falcon, its ability to integrate into the MG2 fire control system meant that although the Sidewinder would be the secondary armament, rockets would be retained as the primary. The Falcon would have done away with rockets entirely. These ideas never left the drawing board, though. Canadian Navy Banshees were thus the first missile-armed Canadian aircraft to see service. So despite these extensive and costly efforts, the Canuck never deployed with anything more potent than a 2 3/4-inch rocket. But that didn't stop its crews having some fun. The CF-100's primary role was bomber interception, but when CF-100s arrived in Europe in late 1956, they discovered a hostile environment. Western European skies were filled with NATO aircraft, and in the absence of real combat, many pilots were looking for the next best thing. Tactical crews had to constantly be on guard against being bounced by nominally friendly formations. These were the days before guided missiles, so duels were fought out within gun range. The objective was to avoid being captured on gun camera film and thus becoming the subject of bragging rights in the mess. Fortunately for the Canadian crews, although the Belgian Mark V's had only rockets, the RCAF Mark IVs still had their machine guns. Furthermore, the Mark V turned out to be rather impeded in BFM by the structural weakness of the extended wings and tail surfaces. 4 aviators were killed in 2 accidents before it was realised that pilots were largely unfamiliar with the recommended G loadings of the aircraft in various weight conditions. The CF-100 Mark V was essentially limited to 5G at low level, whereas the Mark IV could absorb more like 7.5. After a period of adjustment, the Canadian CLUNK found its place in the pecking order. Rather than compare statistics, I've assembled this list from Canadian pilot accounts. The top and the bottom of the list were quite easy to establish. At the top of the tree was the Sabre, specifically the Canadian Mark VI, which was also powered by the Arenda. Sabres would tangle with CLUNKs, but generally they chose solidarity with their compatriots, and they would intervene if the CF-100 drivers got mobbed by other day fighters. There wasn't really much that a CF-100 could do against a Sabre, as it was in no way built for dogfighting. There was, however, one manoeuvre that did on at least one occasion allow a CLUNK driver to capture gun camera footage of a Mark VI. To employ it, the pilot pulled the CF-100 into a steep climb. He then pushed one throttle to the stops while idling the other one and stamping on the rudder. This induced a kind of cartwheel with the nose now pointing straight down at the pursuer. Not to be recommended, but certainly an interesting tactic. At the opposite end of the scale were the F-84F's Thunderstreaks, which were old, heavy and slow, and the F-100 Super Sabre, which was regarded with disdain by other pilots for its almost total lack of turning ability. Most wouldn't even bother to engage either of these types as it wasn't good sport. In between came a variety of aircraft, but most commonly Hunters and Mystères. The Hunter was a dangerous opponent, not far from the Sabre in turning and climbing ability. It did, however, have one flaw that the Canadian Sabre drivers tipped their compatriots off to. When the Hunters appeared, the CLUNKs would wait for them to circle behind them and then at the last moment they would push their noses over into a vertical dive, pull the throttles back to idle, and pop the speed brakes. The Hunter, being heavy and having small speed brakes, would overshoot and have no option but to accelerate and extend away, deafening some poor people on the ground with its sonic boom. But it was French Air Force Mystères that were the CF-100's favourite opponents. On paper, this wasn't much of a fight, as the Mystère was a fast, quite powerful fighter with a swept wing. But once again, the Sabre crews provided a tip-off. The Mystère looked great, but it had aerodynamic flaws. At the top of a steep climb or dive, it would abruptly break away into a spin without warning. Recovery was a lottery, and the French pilots were therefore understandably reluctant to take their aircraft into this flight regime. CLUNK pilots would therefore actively seek out Mystères that had just taken off to maximise their ability to outmaneuver the heavy aircraft. For effect, they'd then buzz the tower with the Mystères trailing forlornly behind. These were wilder days. Whether any of those tactics would have been successful against a MiG-17 or the then new MiG-19 are up for debate. Certainly the large, heavy CLUNK was not totally defenceless, though, and if the weather was bad, it could use its radar and fire control system to attempt a head-on rocket pass at the outset of any engagement. On a clear day, though, large size likely removed any chance of sneaking up on a single-seat fighter. 4 CF-100 squadrons served in Europe, and they were supported by an infrastructure of depot maintenance and support. Overhaul services for the Arender engines and even the complete rebuild of aircraft that had been damaged in mishaps was supplied by Scottish Aviation in Prestwick and Renfrew. Despite the fun that the crews had and the in-isolation usefulness of their ability to navigate at night, the CLUNK's true utility in Europe and North America was fading. By the end of the 1950s, it was too slow and its systems were too vulnerable to countermeasures. The original plan had been to replace it with the CF-105 Arrow, but this was cancelled and CF-100 Voodoos took its place. From April 1961, all-weather Interceptor squadrons began to either convert or they were shut down entirely as the Canadian government reduced its total number of squadrons to save money. The former prides of Canadian aviation were flown to Mountain View on Lake Ontario or to McDonald west of Winnipeg. Most were cut up and melted down on the spot. Remains of many aircraft were taken by rail to the Hamilton Steel Works to be recycled. About 180 others ended up in the scrapyard of James McMaster in Westbourne, Manitoba. He made hay selling souvenirs for decades afterwards. In Europe, the same process was repeated, with CF-104 Starfighters replacing the CLUNKs starting at the end of December 1962. Squadrons changed their designation in the process, becoming fighter-bomber units. Their Canucks were generally scrapped by Scottish Aviation. Although for most aircraft the end came suddenly, a small number of Mark V-Bs were converted into electronic warfare aircraft, initially designated Mark V-C. They arrived for service in April 1959 and incorporated a barrage jammer in the gun pack location, alongside 2 large chaff dispensers, one under each wing. The wingtip, and I assume also the horizontal tail extensions, were removed on these aircraft. Later on, they would receive updated black boxes and comms jamming equipment, becoming Mark V-Ds. The electronic warfare CLUNKs were used to support exercises in which SAC bombers tried to penetrate US airspace from the north. In this capacity, they assisted in the thankfully simulated nukings of Detroit, of DC, Cleveland, and curiously, Savannah, Georgia. Information on the exact nature of the equipment that they carried has eluded me. The system was clearly not that sophisticated or powerful, as reports of exercises with F-106s suggest that the 6s were easily able to burn through the CLUNK's jamming. But there was clearly some tactical usefulness for the airframe, as about a dozen remained in service in the 1980s. Although the airframe life had been previously tested and assessed to be essentially infinite given sensible maintenance, the Arender engines were neither in production or able to be overhauled. Thus ended the career of the CLUNK, a Canadian icon and a decent, if not a world-beating combat aircraft. Avro had many ideas for variants of the Canuck. While the Mark V-M was being developed, Avro proposed an even more powerful version that added a Bristol Orpheus engine on each wingtip. instead of replacing the Arenda 11s with the afterburning Arenda 11R. The Orpheus was a small and quite light engine that produced 4,850 pounds of thrust in a 111-inch package that weighed only 850 pounds. With the extra engines, the resultant Mark 10 would easily be able to climb past 50,000 feet. But because it was quite frankly mad, it never made it to the prototype stage. An even more unusual version was proposed in 1958. At the time, NATO planners were very concerned about the potential for a first strike knocking out airfields and leaving their ground forces without air cover in the face of overwhelming Soviet tank forces. Because the CF-100 was a very large airframe, it seemed readily adaptable as a short or vertical takeoff aircraft. Better still, the large engines were in the perfect position from a centre of gravity perspective. The engines would thus have been replaced with another version of the Orpheus, giving 12,100 pounds of thrust per engine. Avro believed that they could trim the slightly tubby CLUNK back to 28,500 pounds to give the desired 0.85 thrust-to-weight ratio. Achieving the weight required a crash diet. The Arendas were heavier than Orpheuses, so that saved a bit of mass. Then Avro ditched the fire control system, fuselage fuel tank, and the second seat. They then proposed shortening the fuselage by 4 feet and shortening each wing by 8 feet. By the time you add in massive reworking of the nacelles to incorporate the required jet pipes and the internal structure of the fuselage for ducting, you are left with a totally different aircraft. And since the whole proposal hinged around the VTOL Canuck being available long before the Hawker P1127, the huge number of changes needed suggested that it would only be a matter of months ahead of the purpose-built alternative. When Hawker flew their aircraft in October 1960, that was the end of the idea. For a time in 1950, Avro also considered a swept-wing version of the Canuck called the CF-103. A wooden mock-up of this aircraft was produced, but wind tunnel testing suggested that its critical Mach number would only be 0.95, which was scarcely better than the 0.85 of the CF-100. Given the focus on the CF-105, the swept-wing Canuck was cancelled in 1951. What I think these ideas and the extensive efforts to find a missile armament show us is that the RCAF did like the Canuck, but love for something doesn't make it a world beater. The CF-100 was certainly the best straight-winged all-weather interceptor. Its high power and therefore high speed relative to other straight-winged fighters also give it a reasonable case as the best straight-winged jet fighter all told. But the thing is that it was ultimately the best of a breed that was already obsolete. Reading 1950s reports and articles today makes it clear that the RCAF knew this even before the Bison emerged into the daylight. Simply looking over the border at developments in the US showed that high transonic, very high altitude bombers could be made, and they undoubtedly would be made by the Soviets as well as NATO. I love the story of the Canuck. It was a remarkable achievement for a young aviation industry in a relatively small country, militarily speaking. It was also a characterful aircraft that its pilots enjoyed flying, and one that took many of them into some memorable situations. So although I think it's right to celebrate the story, it's also important to be realistic about how good the Canuck really was as a 1950s interceptor.